Hello and welcome to the third live panel discussion of this 24-hour event celebrating the impact of forest landscape restoration right across the globe. My name's Susanna Streeter and I'm your host and moderator of this event. I'm a broadcaster and investment commentator, and I also host environment conferences right around the world. And this discussion today is titled Planting Roots for a Sustainable and Equitable Future. Now, women play a really key role in natural resource use and management, particularly in agriculture and forested landscape systems and along value chains. For instance, women encompass an average of 43% of the agricultural labour force in developing countries. And if women had the same access to productive resources as men, they could increase yields on their farms by 20 to 30%, raising total agriculture output in developing countries by 2.5 to 4%, in turn reducing the number of hungry people across the world by 12 to 17%. Women in forest communities can generate more than 50% of their income from forests, compared with about a third for men. Of 143 economies, 90% though have at least one law restricting economic equality for women, and women have the same legal rights as men to own and access land in only 28 countries worldwide. The data proves that women really need to be at the forefront of planning and implementing restoration. Now, this panel is going to delve deep into that discussion and consider how the forest landscape restoration approach can really help reduce inequalities. And I'm really delighted that we have a fantastic group of women from all over the globe to take part in this discussion. Welcome to you all. First of all, we have Cecile Bibiane Njebet, who's the African Women's Network for Community Management of Forests. She's from Cameroon, and she's a social forester and gender specialist with extensive experience in her field, in the civil service and in international arenas. Welcome to you, Cecile.
Thank you.
We have Samantha Figueroa, who is the Member of Congress of Guatemala. She's the Deputy for the Department of Chimaltenango and is an expert in using the political system and courts to advocate for justice for people and communities. And her words will be translated by Eddie Yes, who is also with us on the discussion. So Samantha and Eddie, welcome to you. We have to discuss as well Lorena.
¿Cómo están? Buenos días. Gusto saludarlos a todos.
Welcome. Slight delay there, but I also want to welcome as well Lorena Aguilar, who's currently the Regional Coordinator for International Cooperation and Research from the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences. But she's also the former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Costa Rica, and she's a former head of the Gender Program at the IUCN. Hello there, Lorena.
Hello, Susanna. How are you doing?
Very well. It's great to have you here on the discussion. And please welcome as well Tangu Tumeo, who's the Principal Forestry Advisor from the Ministry of Natural Resources, Energy and Mining at the Department of Forestry in Malawi. She's also been a very active participant in the restoration journey of Malawi and the Pan-African level as well. Hello there, Tangu. Great to have you here on this panel discussion. Now, let me start first with Samantha, because Guatemala is a leader in forest landscape restoration. It's also been demonstrating how indigenous peoples can and must be brought to the forefront of restoration efforts. So Samantha, can you tell us, does the FLR fit within the way indigenous peoples, especially women, would manage their landscapes? Is traditional wisdom incorporated?
Sí, el modelo de restauración del paisaje forestal es compatible con los sistemas de uso, manejo y conservación de los bosques por parte de los pueblos indígenas. En nuestro caso podemos mencionar, por ejemplo, los esfuerzos de la Asociación de Mujeres en Tecpan, Guatemala, en reforestación, en conservación de recursos naturales, en lo que es medios de vida, sistemas agroforestales, manejo de agua, centros y sitios arqueológicos y gobernabilidad que ellos manejan.
Eddie, can I bring you in here?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. The forest landscape restoration model is compatible with the system of use, management, and conservation of the forest by indigenous people. In our case, we can mention, for example, the effort of the Iximche Women Association and Tecpan, Guatemala, in the forestation, conservation of natural and cultural resources, livelihoods, agroforestry systems, water management, secret sites and centers, and governance. The main custodians of the forest in Guatemala.
Okay, thank you very much, Eddie and Samantha there. Now let me bring in Lorena Aguilar now, because I think that you could add to this point as well, probably backing up what Samantha has said about just why forests are so critical to women's equality.
Well, thank you, Susanna. I think I'm going to turn the question around a little bit and say, why not? For the past 3 decades, we have been saying that women are essential for the work that is being done on forest landscape restoration. We know that at least 1.2 billion people depend on agroforestry, farming, and forestry, and at least 50% of these are women. But is it that women do not have a differentiated access, use, and control of benefits from the forest? You will just point it out. Only 28% countries in the world have the same legal rights. Women and men have the same legal rights to own land. And this is a problem when you see, for example, the payment for environmental services is linked to land tenure. So is it that women and men do not have a different knowledge when it comes to forest? And the answer is definitely no, they don't have the same knowledge. We have seen it in the Amazon, where research is only done by the Humboldt Foundation with men. And then we ask them, why do you bring women? And it make it incredible. 69 new families and 217 new genera were acknowledged by the women that were not acknowledged by the men. And let us not walk when we talk about the differentiated impact on gender and climate change. We know, for example, with the drug reduction that we're having on food crops, women in developing countries find themselves already 50% facing anemia. So the question is, why not? When women are not only suffering the impacts that we're saying, but not involving them, but they're incredible action agents of change. And we can talk more about that in the next round of questions.
Absolutely. Let me now bring in Tangu Tomeo, because Tangu, you convinced the government in Malawi that a gender responsive restoration opportunities assessment really would benefit your country. So what are the key lessons that you can share with all of us and the audience on the route your country's taken to ensure gender responsive restoration, right from planning all the way to implementation?
Thank you very much, Susanna. For us, there have been 2 main impacts that you can actually see in places where we've achieved a lot of restoration goals that we had set. First is the increased motivation amongst women to engage, because they are over half of our population and they're the main food producers in the country. So the fact that they didn't have land rights, the fact that they thought that their voice was not being listened to, had impacted the way they were motivated to engage in these restoration activities. So what has happened so far, we were fortunate to have a project which was funded by IUCN, which we called Her Farm Radio Project, where we gave women increased access to messages on restoration. That brought up a lot, increased a lot of the motivation amongst women groups that were participating in this project. The other thing was that we included them in monitoring. So we going to a farm which is engaging in restoration activities, talking to their fellow women on how they are going about their activities, assisted them to say, okay, I can also do this when they went back to their own farms. So for us, ensuring that our assessment was gender responsive was very important to make sure that we get to our goals faster. I mean, we are talking about more than half the population here that we can't afford to not hear their voices.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you talk about confidence, giving women confidence to share their experiences. Let me bring in Cecile now, because Cecile, you have first-hand experience with restoration projects where women have been leading planning and implementation. So what difference do you see between these projects and ones where women have been excluded or not adequately empowered?
Thank you. I think, first of all, if the women are not included, the project will fail. We have seen that. We have concrete examples that show they have to be there if they need the project to succeed. Women have a better perception and knowledge of the importance of forests, their usefulness in their lives. Women know very well that without forests, life is in danger. In the reforestation, you know, this is an activity that requires a lot of patience and endurance. And it is only women that can drive it better because they are patient and enduring by nature. Only women also can devote their time, their energy, and their technical skills to it without waiting for an immediate gain. We have seen that. It has been demonstrated. So projects that included women in the planning process were more successful than those that did not. Even the rate of success, recovery or regeneration of seedlings was higher in those projects. Taking specifically an example on the mangrove, what women are doing in the mangrove areas. You know, let's talk about the mangrove logging chain or value chain. Women are at the beginning of the chain and also at the end, because women also cut the poles to make firewood, to smoke the fish, and they also sell the mangrove wood in bottles in the cities. So you see that the role of women is in mangrove is there. When we are talking about the forest land, women also cut wood for charcoal, and they sell the charcoal to make a living. And they are also responsible for agricultural production. They clear the forest areas for their agricultural activities. You know also for many countries that the family farming is one of the drivers of deforestation in our countries. So for the activities they carry out, women must be part of the forest landscape restoration programs. And lastly, women represent more than 50% of the population globally. They represent in our countries from 60 to 72% of manpower in agricultural sector, and they are leading forest restoration in our various African countries. Does it make sense to exclude women from the forest landscape restoration program? They should be part of that, and this should be at all levels. Thank you.
There's lots of heads nodding in agreement, Cecile. Let me bring back in Lorena, because I think you were going to talk about it a little bit earlier, just how we can ensure then, given the benefits of women's involvement, how can we ensure the full and fair participation of women in restoration?
Well, first of all, we need to take actions to overcome some of those gender gaps that prevent them from fully participating. And I'm going to give you an example of what we're doing right now in Costa Rica. You know that Costa Rica is one of the countries that have worked more on payment for environmental services. At the moment, we're developing what it's called a gender equality seal for productive units, because we have to unlink land tenure to be able to receive some of those payment for environmental services and landscape restoration work that they do. So what we are going to do is award to those units managed by women that are working on restoration and recuperation of the forest with the special grants that comes from our carbon market. So the most important thing, Susana, is to overcome some of those gender gaps that prevent them. For example, they need to have access to credits. They need to have access to other financial resources. They need to have access to assistance. For example, in our country, less than 50% of the women have access to technical assistance. You point that out in the case of agriculture. If they only had the same access, they could really enhance the work that they're doing. So I think the key is to understand what are those gender gaps that prevents women full participation, and then work consistently. That's what gender responsive means. Look at those gender gaps and take actions to close those gaps. And those gaps vary from country to country and sometimes from community to community within the same area that you're working.
Okay, Lorena, thank you. So let's focus on how you do that and the consequences if it's done correctly. Let me bring back in Tangu, because Tangu, you're heavily engaged and involved in restoration efforts at the field level. So tell us just some of the impacts that you've seen, especially for the daily lives of women.
The first one that I can talk about is the strength in local governance, because we've talked about gender mainstreaming for years in Malawi, and you'd have committees, village level committees or council committees that have women, 5 or 4 women within the groups, but those women were not talking. There wasn't active participation of those women to contribute to the decisions that were being made. So what we are seeing now is that having been given a voice, having provided a platform where every voice is heard, there's been strengthened a local governance, because there's been that understanding of each other's interests and needs moving forward. Because otherwise, without that, we can't move forward, because the women are the farmers, and largely our men in the communities move out of the villages to go to towns to engage in other economic activities. And for us as well, we have an advantage with the fact that our government engages communities at village level to develop action plans. So that's our good entry point, and that has been a good tool for us to ensure that everybody is participating actively and contributing to the identification of degraded areas, identification of interventions that have to be implemented, putting into context all the dynamics that are going on within this particular community, making decisions on what incentives they would like to get, for what reasons, and what other economic activities or income generating activities can be brought together to influence better implementation of the restoration intervention. So it's really been good for us to ensure that the governance is improved, everybody's voice is heard, women are contributing to decisions that are being made, because they are the ones that are eventually going to implement the restoration on the ground.
And Tangu, the more you see women sharing their stories, does that spur other women to come forward and say, I really want to take part, and this is my view, and you've got to listen to what I say? Is that giving them more confidence?
It is. And culturally, women don't own land. So they might not be custodians of the land themselves, but if they talk to another woman farmer who is engaged in restoration activities and benefiting from such, we have noticed that, as much as they are waiting for the man to have the final say at the end, but he's not in the village, he's not working on the farm every day. We have noticed that that exchange, that learning that is happening during their interactions is helping us to make progress.
That's great. Lorena, I think you wanted to come in here and make a point.
Yeah, just what Tang was saying. In my former life when I was in IUCN, we also saw that women were more willing to take risk in restoration initiatives than men. And I see Tangu and Cecile nodding to that. So that is also fundamental in the work that we're doing.
Let me bring back in Samantha Figueroa now, because I'd really like to find out a little bit more about how the implementation of forest landscape restoration has benefited the Indigenous women, and what really needs to be done as far as the experience in Guatemala is concerned to try and secure the participation of Indigenous peoples, particularly women, in restoration. Eddie, if you could put that point to Samantha, I'd be very grateful.
los pueblos indígenas se benefician directamente con la recuperación del paisaje forestal, sobre todo con los bienes y servicios que aporta el bosque en Guatemala. Además, contamos con incentivos en la producción, en la conservación y manejo de bosques, por lo que creemos que vamos en el camino correcto de la visibilización de las necesidades de los pueblos originarios, haciendo desarrollo territorial de manera equitativa e incluyente. Por ejemplo, las acciones que viene trabajando la oficina de UICN en Guatemala están fortaleciendo la participación de indígenas y de mujeres, como es el caso de la asociación que acompaña a varios grupos de mujeres y quienes han demostrado que el trabajo colectivo es fundamental para la supuesto que necesitamos hacer más conciencia a la población y fortalecer la legislación con el potencial de Guatemala para hacer restauración del paisaje forestal. Podemos reducir muchas de las necesidades de las poblaciones originarias y principalmente de las mujeres indígenas.
Thank you, Samantha. Eddie?
Okay, let me translate that for you. Yeah, the indigenous people benefit directly from recovery of the forest landscape, especially with goods and service provided by the forest. In Guatemala, we also have incentives for the production, conservation, and management of forests. So we believe that we are on the road correctly in visibility of the needs of Native people by making territorial developments in equitability in inclusive manner. For example, the actions which the IUCN office in Guatemala has been working are strengthening the participation of the indigenous people and women, as in the case of the Social Association, which companions various women's groups, Cachiquels, Quechí, and Quiches, who has shown the collective working essential for the conservation of the forest landscape. Of course, we need to raise awareness in population and strengthen the legislation to make a process inclusive. However, we believe that we have the potential in Guatemala to restore the forest landscape. We can reduce many needs of a native population and mainly indigenous women.
Great, thank you very much, Eddie and Samantha. Let me bring back in Lorena just briefly there. Samantha mentioned possible legislation. Do you think that's necessary in all cases, or do you think that often the legislation exists for the framework to develop, it's just not used properly?
Well, we need both things, Susanna. We need good legislation, but we also need the implementation of that legislation, because sometimes just producing laws or new frameworks doesn't move things at the ground. So also you need for the people that are supposedly to be recipient of those laws or those frameworks to be aware of them and know what they can ask for and what they can demand from these processes. But legislations are important as long as they're implemented. And we have seen that not only in the forestry case, but in any of the other areas in the environmental sectors. We need to walk the talk, not only develop those legislations.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you, Lorena. Let me bring in some of the questions that we have had from the audience as this debate has gone on. So Lynn from the UK asks, what role does culture and tradition play in mobilizing people on the ground? What are some of the challenges you've encountered? And Cecile, can I put that question to you? Have there been challenges encountered with regards to culture and tradition?
Yeah, thank you. As Lorena has just said, we can have, and that is what is happening, good legislation, or let's say at least neutral to gender neutral legislation, but the practices at the local level brings a lot of problems. The practices, so the implementation, as she was stressing, and that's exactly the place the culture is playing. Because when the legislation is written, in culture, for cultural beliefs and cultural practices, women cannot own land. And the legislation is saying everybody has a right to own land, while culturally, women cannot own land. Women cannot sit at the same table with men to take decisions culturally. They should share their decision with their husband, who will report during the meeting what the wife has said. So the culture is very strong. And the culture is not something we can change just because we want to change it. It takes time. We have as experience here in Cameroon, working with traditional chiefs. What we have been doing is to work with their wife, to let the wife understand why it is important to have women on board. And then the wife will work with their husband to explain to them, because the women power in our culture is under the table, is during the night. You know, it's not something you have to bring on the day on the table. Then you feel like being European Western. And this has affected women for many, many, many years. They have been educated in that way. So the culture, if we really want to move forward, we want any changes, we need to work to improve the culture. What we usually say to our traditional chiefs, we are not coming to erase the culture. No, it's not our action, but it's only that what is bad in the culture that prevents you yourself from improving your own conditions, you know, your development, your economic condition. Then they start hearing, they start listening, because they see their interest taken into account. And we ensure them that we are not taking your place. We are not fighting we are not competing with you, but we see that if the women cannot own land, they cannot invest in that land to improve the production of the land, to sustain the life of your family and of the communities. We need to work on that, because the legislation is very far from the cultural beliefs and the cultural practices.
Tangu, I can see you're nodding your head as well. Would you share what Cecile has been saying? Is that a similar situation in Malawi?
It is. I mean, Africa is just one huge group of people that are culturally very similar. What she has said is equally true for us. The government instituted a new land law in 2016, which clearly talks about, brings about new guidelines for land allocations. But that's a government law. When we go to the village, we have a chief, we have our clan leaders, and women. I mean, if it's not you, I mean, so we have two traditions where a woman marries and moves to the husband's place, or the husband would move to come to the woman's village. In both cases, men still make decisions, because if the man has come to your village, it is your uncle or your brothers that will be making decisions on land. If you've moved to your husband's village, it is your husband and his male counterparts that will be making decisions on what happens on particular land and who gets what. So for us, it is a challenge, because the law was instituted in 2016. Culture in villages is still superseding that government law. We would want to see how that gets implemented, as Lorena has mentioned. It's not only having beautiful laws that talk about how good women and men are all going to benefit from that. It's the implementation. How do we make it work for our people, for us to achieve better results from what we're doing? Because owning land for a woman will motivate her. She doesn't want to feel as if she doesn't belong. What if her husband dies? She will be chased back to go to her village. And when she goes there, she doesn't belong, because culturally she was belonging to the husband's people. So it's not as easy to have good laws. It's the implementation, as Lorena has said. And for us, as Cecilia has also mentioned, it's not going to be a one-day thing, but it's something that we are doing daily to allow us to work with the traditional authorities, to work with our clan leaders, to get them to a point where they understand the importance of having women as landholders, as having women as part of the decision-making groups. We don't want women to be involved in a group discussion here, and then men go somewhere else and make the final decision when the women are not involved. No, that has to stop. And that's the only way really we are going to get to a point where the woman is comfortable and understands her right and role in our countries when it comes to restoration.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to put the next point to Lorena, because we have a question through from Liam in the UK who says, and this perhaps could be part of the solution, should gender balance at implementation stage be a prerequisite for organisations, particularly when they receive a grant to implement a project?
Susanna, you know, the interesting thing is that all the major financing mechanisms right now related to climate change, in which a lot of the work on FLR is being conducted at the moment, all of them have now gender policies that every person that receives a grant needs to follow. It's instrumental, but it's not only about gender balance. It's about weaving gender responsiveness into the initiatives. This gender is not a little annex, or it's a phrase that said, and women will be included. We need to look at those elements that prevent the full engagement and participation of everyone, because it also depends on your youth. It also depends on your social status. If you are a young woman, the possibilities that you have are more limited. So I fully agree. I mean, this is a fight that we have been giving, and now all the major financing mechanisms have as a requisite to mainstream gender. Of course, that comes in many flavors and forms, but the requisite is there. Now, again, as Tangu and Cecile and Samantha are talking about, is how to do it, and how to do it in the right way to bring the 100% of the people to be agents of change in these challenges that cannot keep on going with only half of the population in the world.
Absolutely. Well, let me bring back in Samantha and Eddie. I would like to put that point to Samantha with the help of Eddie. So do you think, Samantha, that gender balance at implementation stage of a project should be prerequisite for organisations so that they can receive grants? Should grants only be given to organisations that have a good gender balance? Let me see if Eddie can put that to Samantha. And in the meantime, once Samantha's had time to digest that question, I'd like to move on in a moment to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on all the different projects that Lorena, Tangu and Cecile have been involved in, because I think that's one discussion that we haven't yet covered and is absolutely key at this present moment in time. But let me move back to Eddie to find out if we can get a response from Samantha. Eddie, can you hear me? Yes, Eddie, did you
we're ready
get
to the answer?
Great, lovely. So Samantha, yes.
Sí, realmente en Guatemala se ha implementado dos maneras de trabajar. Una es a través de las concesiones que se le dan a asociaciones, y otra es la que se dan a las mismas comunidades dentro de la región que se quiere reforestar o realizar algún proyecto de reforestación de los paisajes, de los bosques. Entonces, Guatemala ha funcionado, la legislación así lo permite, tanto en las instituciones del Estado como a través de asociaciones civiles. Entonces, es una forma de poder. Claro que las asociaciones velan porque se haga una distribución. Se ha trabajado incluso mejor con grupos de mujeres, por lo menos en la región de Occidente, como lo es Chimaltenango, como lo es Huehuetenango, como lo es Quiché, que se trabaja a través de asociaciones quienes dan proyectos a estos grupos de mujeres en cada una de sus comunidades. Entonces, las dos formas de trabajar están bien implementadas porque se apoyan las unas con las otras.
Thank you. Eddie.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, if really in Guatemala, two ways of working have been implemented. One through the concept of the land, and it's to generate through the groups, right? And there is groups that also has working with the groups of women, such as what his en Chimaltenango and Huehuetenango and Quiche. Okay, so what she was saying is that in here in Guatemala, the associations they've been consist some land and ground. They've been working and try to do it equally in gender, right, with the woman and the man, and so far has been working, right. But there is times too also that the gender is the issue, right, because in the indigenous in here, for example, the man most of the time wants to own the land and intervene in our projects, right? We want to empower the woman with the land. That's what she's saying.
Great, so thank you. So it's a very similar shared experience as we've heard from Tangu, as we've heard from Cecile, in so many different countries around the world. I want to move on now to COVID-19 and the impact that it's had on some of the restoration projects that you've been involved in. Lorena Aguilar, can you tell me a little bit about what you see as the impact? Because with social distancing, with the effect on supply chains, it must have been potentially devastating for some of these projects.
Yes, it has been, especially because a lot of the norms that had been created around COVID-19 are designed for urban settings and not for everyone in the urban cities either. So when, for example, in slums, in the urban settings, you're asking people to have social distances and to be in their house when the only pipe water is 1 kilometer away from their households and they have to do lines, will also have a differentiated impact in rural settings. Because, for example, how are they not being allowed to go out to commercialize some of their products? And they have also been in lockdown, some of our indigenous communities. The other impact that we have had is how to continue ongoing with some of the activities within the projects that we are conducting when we cannot go and continue the process. So we have to be very creative and try to use phones and other system, regular mail to get through processes. So this is devastating, as you will say, for the economy, a lot of the people, for the risks that they have to take to survive, Susana, because it's not easy for them to remain at home when their daily life depends on the 50 cents that they can make for selling their products outside their communities.
Absolutely, I can imagine. And Cecile, has there been a similar impact, would you say, in Cameroon?
Oh, yes. I think in Cameroon, we have two different situations. And the worst is in the rural, because the government has started working, let's say, information and all these equipment is for the urban areas population. And even there, as Lorena said, it's not for everybody. It's really for the big cities. These small cities, like where I am in Edea, you will find one Kwara which has got something and 5 others have not. And it's worse in the rural. You see, rural women, let me talk about rural women, they depend on agricultural activities. And they find themselves locked down in their homes because they are afraid of COVID contamination. We even experience some places where giving even access to the neighbor became very, very difficult. And they have lost their product because they could not get to the market to sell them. And some are even got afraid to go to their farms. We are very pessimistic for next year production, agricultural production. We are sure that people will starve. We'll get into the starving next year because the women who needed to go to the farm have not been able to do so. Only the positive things we can get for COVID is that they could organize themselves to fight again because they did not get access to this equipment. So they started using forest products to heal themselves, to prevent themselves, to try to, they say, if you have fever, then you'll get into this. So they started using non-timber forest product as medicine to prevent themselves from cutting this COVID-19. So as Lorena said, it has been devastating. It's really a worst thing for women. I think they will get their situation worsened by this COVID-19 because they have lost their production, they have lost almost everything. And this is where they gain their living. And when everything is lost, life is done.
Absolutely. I'm feel it desperate times, but as you've been saying, you've been explaining about the projects are there, they are underway. You're all working extremely hard to make sure that there is a much better gender equality at the heart of all of the projects. I'm very sorry to say that it's all we have time for. I know Lorena wanted to come in there at the end, but we've already overrun by around 10 minutes, but there was so much to say. And thank you very much for taking part in the really fascinating discussion. I want to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists, Lorena, Cecile, Tanguy, Samantha, and Eddie. It's been great to have you here at this conference, but we are going to now have an hour break, but we'll be back with the next panel entitled UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and the role that FLR plays in this decade. So thank you all very much for taking part in this.